and parietal lobe separated by the central sulcus. In the back, we find our occipital lobe, and most lateral, we have a temporal lobe. The left and right cerebral hemispheres are separated from one another by this longitudinal fissure, into which sits an extension of the dura mater known as the falx cerebri. In the frontal lobe, just anterior to the central sulcus, we have this precentral gyrus, home to the primary somatic motor area. Just posterior, we find the post-central gyrus, home to the primary somatosensory area. You move and get hurt before you feel it. Yeah? Think about that. You move and get hurt before you feel it. Along the side, we'll find a transverse, lateral, or sylvian fissure. If we were able to spread these apart on this model, we'd see a much deeper structure known as an insula. We find a transverse fissure back here separating the overlying cerebrum from the underlying cerebellum. Within this, or separating the cerebrum and cerebellum, we find another extension of the dura mater known as the transverse cerebelli, separating the left and right hemispheres of the cerebellum, which are joined at an area known as a vermis. We find another extension of that dura mater. You can't see it in here, but you have to imagine it in here, known as that falx cerebelli, also wraps around the cerebellum itself. Now, I want you to be able to open up this model, if I can even do that, and explore some of the deeper structures of the cerebrum, the internal diencephalon, areas where the left and right hemisphere are joined, allowing axons to cross over from one side to the other, known as the corpus callosum. Just inferior to that, we have this flap of tissue separating the lateral ventricles from the third ventricle, known as the fornix. Even though we're here in the third ventricle, this blue highlighted with red lines indicative of the choroid plexus of the third ventricle, just lateral to this would be the halves of the thalamus. Matter of fact, really quick, here. Sorry, I just totally stabbed you. We find the thalamic halves, the halves under the thalamus, under which we have the hypothalamus attached to the hypophysis, also known as the pituitary gland. This pituitary gland is joined to the hypothalamic region via this tiny string known as an infundibulum or an infundibular stalk. The two halves of the thalamus are joined at a piece of tissue best displayed here, known as the interthalamic adhesion or the intermediate mass. That goes through the third ventricle. Give me the ventricle model. And when we look at the negative model of the ventricle, we can see a hole in the third ventricle. This hole is not the interventricular foramen. Many students say that because it only exists because something's going through here, that intermediate mass that joins the two halves of the thalamus. Remember, these ventricles are hollow cavities in the brain, home to these pink areas known as choroid plexi, specialized network of capillaries lined by ependymal cells known to produce and secrete the very same cerebral spinal fluid we found traveling down the central canal of the spinal cord that we found in that subarachnoid space. Coming back to this half a brain, let's have a look at, not really clear on this brain, not my favorite model, I must say. as far as the brains go. But we should be able to observe an epithalamus in here, which will end in a pineal gland. It should be on this side. My bad. Like I said, I don't really like this model. But the epithalamus ending in a pineal gland. On the posterior side, I'm going to come back to this model. We find a pair of superior colliculi and a pair of inferior colliculi, these tiny bumps. When taken together, 1, 2, 3, 4, make up the corpora quadremina, also known as the tectum, that help to tie in auditory stimuli with visual tracking. That little pink bump right there is our pineal gland, or the very end of the epithalamus. This void is the same as this, being the fourth ventricle, armed with 2 lateral and 1 median aperture that pushes that cerebral spinal fluid around the whole brain. Anteriorly, we can see cranial nerve number 2 here, our olfactory nerve. Cranial nerve number 3, our ocular motor nerve. We find 2 mammillary somethings. They're not glands. Bodies, mammillary bodies under here. Takes us into the mesencephalon, right? That midbrain that's joining the diencephalon with the brainstem itself. Components of that brainstem, also known as the rhombencephalon or hindbrain, are going to be the overlying pons, the underlying medulla oblongata, home to an area known as the pyramids of decussation, where white tracts ascending up the spinal cord literally cross over. Tracts descending down the spinal cord literally cross over, so that 1/2 or hemisphere of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. Attached to this diencephalon model, we have the last of the cranial nerves, including the trochlear, trigeminal. We'll move back inside to our abducens, facial, vestibulocochlear, glossopharyngeal, vagus, accessory, and hypoglossal. That's essentially anything I could ask you on that model. So we'll move on to another one.